What's going on, man? Welcome back to the basement. I'm Ron, and it is officially week 1 of the NFL season, which means we are transitioning from our draft strategy, targets, avoids, fades, must drafts, into our in-season management, which means waiver wire, weekly rankings. But before we get into any of that, I wanted to do a fun video today where we look at players' schedules in the beginning and end of the season, and we kind of identify some buy low and sell high trade targets through the first 1 to 4 weeks of the NFL season. Let's not waste any time. Make sure you get down below, subscribe, leave a like if you enjoyed the video. Let's go.
Thirsty, trying to choose. I know I'm critical. My nitty bag.
Now, before we get into this video, I know a lot of you guys have your fantasy drafts coming up tonight. Make sure if you haven't already, you check out patreon.com/Ron Stewart for my full top 200 PPR and full PPR rankings. I myself am really old school. I use the rankings that I provide to the patrons. I would have that ranking sheet regardless of if I made content. I bring it with me into every draft and cross them off as I go. So if you want to go out there, dominate your home league, check out patreon.com/Ron Stewart. And even if you sign up now, you'll have it through the end of September. So you'll even have my weekly rankings, my start sits. You'll have my fab guidance every week. You'll have my rest of season rankings, all of that good stuff. So check out patreon.com/Ron Stewart. I'll have it at the top of the description and at the top of the comments below. And our first early season buy on this list is going to be Breece Hall. And as much as I love Breece Hall, the player, I think in leagues where you can make trades, he's someone you could probably buy for cheaper than you can draft him right now in fantasy. Of course, we have the reports coming out that Michael Carter is the one on the depth chart, though I'd assume early on it's probably just going to be a 50-50 split with like Michael Carter, I guess, as the 1A. But I think that's going to really throw off Breece Hall owners out there if they see Michael Carter getting a lot of the high-value touches, if Breece Hall starts slow. And there's a good chance that Breece Hall starts slow because of how brutal the Jets' beginning of the season schedule is, where they have Baltimore, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Pittsburgh. Miami's not that great, but Green Bay, Denver, New England, Buffalo, all teams with 8.5 win totals or better besides Miami. And you sort of want Michael Carter to be the lead back in those games where he doesn't look great and they start shifting the workload to Breece Hall. And then it sort of lines up in this way where by the bye week, maybe coming out of the bye week, Breece Hall is the starter. And then you have a really easy stretch of games from weeks 12 through week 17 where you have Chicago, Minnesota, and Buffalo are tough. I think Minnesota hasn't been great against running backs the last couple of years in fantasy. And then you just have a mouth-watering playoff schedule here where Breece Hall sees Detroit, Jacksonville, Seattle, and has the easiest schedule for fantasy running backs in the fantasy playoffs. If he becomes a starter by the bye week, he is going to be somebody that you might need to have in the playoffs to come out ahead. So again, I like the idea of approaching the Breece Hall manager in your league and see if he's a little spooked after a couple of down weeks and see if you can get him for cheap. And then we have Chris Godwin as another buy where it's pretty straightforward, where he's coming off of an ACL tear. But luckily for Godwin, his schedule is perfect so that it gets all of his toughest matchups out of the way early, and then it really lightens up down the stretch, where from weeks 1 through 14, he has the toughest schedule for wide receivers, and then he has the easiest schedule among wide receivers in the fantasy playoffs. By the way, we're using PFF's fantasy strength of schedule metric here, which takes into account previous years' fantasy scoring across the positions, and then also takes into account the current landscape of PFF grades for position groups so that you're getting a more accurate representation of roster turnover, so it's not just last year's points allowed stats. And the way they grade the strength of schedule is that 10 is the easiest, 0 is the hardest, and it's a scale from 10 to 0. And when we look at Godwin, he has a 0. So he has the first toughest schedule from weeks 1 through 13, and then he gets a really easy playoff schedule where he's going up against defenses like the Cardinals and the Panthers for those final 2 weeks, where by then he should really be able to turn up in the playoffs. And essentially the play is here is that early on in the season, he's going to have the Cowboys, who's a tough matchup, the Saints, who's a tough matchup. He's going to be limited in those first couple games, I think, probably going to see less than like 75% of the snaps. And if he comes out slow, you should be able to approach a Chris Godwin owner and buy him for cheap. And then we have Cole Kmet, and his schedule is actually really easy altogether, where he has the 25th toughest weeks 1 through 14 schedule, and then the 26th toughest playoff schedule. So all of those isn't that bad, right? So that's 25th means it's like top 7 and easiest. I don't know. It's hard to sort of conceptualize, but he has an easy schedule all throughout, but he has his toughest 2 games out the gates against San Francisco and then against Green Bay. There's a chance that this offense just has 0 juice against San Fran and Green Bay, and you see them score combined like 18 points through 2 weeks, and things start to get ugly for the Bears players in fantasy. And I think that this applies not only just to Cole Kmet, but also to Darnell Mooney and Justin Fields. Now, this is pretty standard with an offense like this. I expect growing pains for a young quarterback in Justin Fields and a new offensive system, but I think we'll see things start to turn around by week 3 versus the Texans and then week 4 versus the Giants. So I think the perfect spot to jump in on these Bears players is going to be after that week 2 game against the Packers, probably 2 down games for the offense. People are going to be out on the Bears. It's a dumpster fire, whatever. I think that is the time to strike. Now, of course, Kmet isn't an elite tight end, but if you punted the position and you're looking around for tight ends and someone maybe they drafted a Kittle and they backed him up with Kmet, I think that's pretty standard in a home league. I think it would make sense to approach that guy, and you could pretty much trade your hot new waiver wire addition or just a name off of waivers and essentially get a guy like Cole Kmet for free after like 2 weeks, which then brings us to the sell part. Players that we want to be selling high early in the season. And I think the first guy that comes to mind is Antonio Gibson. He fits the profile of an early season sell where he has one of the lightest early season schedules opening up against the Jaguars and the Lions, and he has the easiest schedule through 14 weeks. And I think especially in those first 2 games without Brian Robinson, he's going to see a good share of the touches. And again, against the Jaguars and the Lions, it wouldn't be shocking if Antonio Gibson through 2 weeks was like the RB8, RB9, RB10, something like that. And I think when that happens, it would make sense to sell him for a few reasons. Because one is Brian Robinson, where Brian Robinson, yes, he's dealing with his injury. They have him on, I believe, the PUP right now or the IR. He's due to come back by week 5, or not due to come back, but he can return as early as week 5. I don't think that he's going to be out for the season. I think that we see Brian Robinson come back by week 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. And whenever that point comes where Brian Robinson comes back and starts squeezing Gibson's between the tackles touches, because that's the only reason that Gibson is really attractive right now, where he's the between the tackles guy in this offense. McKissick has all the passing down work, but the minute Brian Robinson returns to play and starts taking away those between the tackles looks, and Gibson has a touch squeeze coming from both sides, he becomes no longer attractive anymore. He becomes a lot less interesting, and with that, I think the move would be is that if he has 1 to 2 big games out the gate, that you capitalize on that and just put that into somebody else, right? Maybe buy a Breece Hall plus for much cheaper. And his last 2 games in the fantasy playoffs aren't that great either. He has the 49ers and the Browns, making his back half of the season much less appealing, especially if Brian Robinson is in those games. Which brings us to our last sell for today, Miles Sanders. And Miles Sanders right now has some kind of hamstring injury where he wasn't practicing, but now he's practicing. He's a question mark for week 1, but this is in the world where he plays in week 1 and does well. I think if he plays in week 1, he'll be a pretty easy early season sell target where the Eagles are playing against the Lions in week 1. That's going to be a really easy matchup. And if Sanders sees, 5 catches, 100 total yards, and a touchdown, and you could see his value skyrocket because this is a guy who was a 5th round pick last year, like a 3rd round pick before that. And all people that have seen him go that high want to see is just one good game. And if he comes out against the Lions, he looks great. I think that you could see his value go up to like that RB20, RB15-ish range. And then from there, you can sell him. Now, you guys might be saying, why sell Miles Sanders at that point? And what it boils down to is Miles Sanders, we've seen him these last couple of years. If he has a lower body injury in August, that's usually not a great sign. So he already has a hamstring issue here. That's not a great sign moving forward. And then you also have a touch squeeze coming from both sides where Boston Scott will be taking away touches between the tackles. And then Miles Sanders won't be catching passes in this offense. You'll have Kenneth Gainwell as the 3rd down back. Kenneth Gainwell will even take red zone touches away. Jalen Hurts will take red zone touches away. I just think that if you can sell high after that first week, that's the direction I would go in. He also has a pretty tough playoff schedule, the 7th toughest playoff schedule. He has a game against the Cowboys and a game against the Seahawks. Again, if Sanders' value skyrockets after week 1, I think that's a great spot to cash out on him. Now, that's going to do it for us today, fellas. This is a little bit of a short one and not as deep as I usually go, but this, again, isn't a hard and fast early season trade target video. Early season projections are super fragile. So are strength of schedule without any games. All of this is really fragile, but it's something to keep an eye out on. So just make sure you're keeping tabs on these players. If you own any of them, if you're thinking about buying any of these guys, just keep tabs because I think early season, those first weeks 1 through 4 is probably the most fertile ground for buying and selling players, where you could have gotten Jonathan Taylor for super cheap. You could have cashed out on someone like Mike Williams. So there's a lot of value to be had in those first 4 weeks where, yes, we have a lot of information by then, but we don't have a large sample size. So there is a lot of variance that you can sort of capitalize on there. Now, as always, if you enjoyed the video, make sure you comment below, subscribe, leave a like, and I will see you guys in the next one.
I know I'm pretty cool. My nitty bag, my kitty boots. I got the juice, I got the juice.
Channel, Chatham's on. Foolies glad I'm home. Even my haters kinda glad I'm on.